Section 1. The Trap Springs. The metallic tang of burning oil filled Lieutenant Khalil's nostrils as he crouched in his T-55, watching American armor materialize through the pre-dawn haze like steel phantoms, their thermal sights already painting death across the Kuwaiti desert. This is the story of how 500,000 Iraqi soldiers discovered that modern warfare had left them behind, fighting a war their commanders understood, but their technology couldn't win. It's about what happens when national pride collides with precision-guided reality, when soldiers trained for the last war face weapons designed for the next one. August 2nd, 1990. At 2 a.m., Iraqi forces crossed into Kuwait under cover of darkness, their tracks churning through sand that would soon become their grave. Within 48 hours, Kuwait City fell, and Baghdad declared it Iraq's 19th province. The world watched Saddam Hussein's gamble unfold, a calculated grab for oil wealth that would trigger the most lopsided military confrontation in modern history. But from Baghdad's perspective, this wasn't recklessness. This was strategic necessity. Iraq owed $60 billion from its war with Iran, and Kuwait was pumping oil beyond OPEC quotas, driving down prices and strangling Iraq's recovery. Saddam believed the Americans were paper tigers, bloodied in Vietnam, and unwilling to fight for a distant emirate most couldn't locate on a map. By October, 430,000 Iraqi troops had dug into Kuwait and southeastern Iraq, creating what they called the Saddam Line, a layered network of minefields, anti-tank ditches, sand berms, and oil-filled flame trenches designed to blunt any Saudi-led counterattack. Iraqi engineers had studied the Iran-Iraq War's lessons, building fixed positions that could channel enemy armor into killing zones where pre-registered artillery would shred advancing columns. The defensive work stretched across the Kuwaiti desert like a concrete and steel spiderweb. Soldiers burned waste oil in 55-gallon drums for warmth, the acrid smoke giving their trenches a metallic taste and constant cough. Desert nights fell near freezing along the Gulf Coast, and conscripts slept on pallets beside their tanks, boots crusted with salt from morning fog. But something felt wrong to the veterans among them. The radio chatter from Baghdad grew increasingly shrill, defensive. Food rations, watery fazoulia beans and flatbread arrived irregularly. Spare parts disappeared. UN Security Council Resolution 661 had imposed sweeping sanctions on August 6th, and the squeeze was already being felt in ammunition depots and fuel dumps across Iraq. Iraqi planners had expected Arab public opinion to fracture any Western coalition. Instead, Egypt and Syria sent troops, and the Arab League backed UN demands for withdrawal. The isolation was complete, but Baghdad's propaganda machine worked overtime, painting the coming fight as a new Qadisiyah, the 7th century battle where Arab forces defeated the Persian Sassanids. State television looped footage of soldiers digging positions, their spades biting into desert hardpan while Ba'ath Party slogans echoed from loudspeakers. Iraqi pilots dispersed their aircraft to hardened shelters, scattering radar decoys and dummy surface-to-air missile sites across the country. They expected a replay of the War of the Cities, with Iran missile terror and grinding attrition, not the precision surgical strike that was actually coming. The Republican Guard formations Hammurabi, Medina, Tawakkalna waited in reserve north of Kuwait City as mobile counterattack forces, their crews confident in Soviet-trained tactics and battle-tested equipment. These were the elite units, the regime's insurance policy, commanded by officers who had survived 8 years of war against Iran. In staff meetings, Iraqi generals studied maps of Wadi al-Batin, the dry riverbed they considered their ace in the hole. Mine it heavily, fix the enemy advance, then hammer them with artillery fire missions already plotted and registered. It was textbook Soviet defensive doctrine, proven effective against human wave attacks and conventional armored assaults. But across the border in Saudi Arabia, Operation Desert Shield was packing the kingdom with coalition armor and air power that operated by completely different rules. American satellites watched every Iraqi movement, recording the precise coordinates of every bunker, every radar installation, every command post. Stealth aircraft were already rehearsing flight paths through Iraqi airspace, their pilots memorizing the radar gaps that would let them strike with complete surprise. Picture yourself as that Iraqi lieutenant, checking your equipment in the pre-dawn cold, wondering if your family back in Basra is proud of your service, unaware that American F-117 pilots are already studying photographs of your exact position. The desert wind carried strange sounds, now the distant rumble of coalition aircraft, the electronic whine of jamming equipment, the crackle of radio frequencies being tested and retested. Something massive was building just beyond the horizon, and Iraq's half-million-man army was about to discover that all their preparations, all their confidence, all their Soviet training manuals were about to become artifacts of a warfighting era that had already ended. If you're watching this at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in Phoenix, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think Baghdad's biggest strategic miscalculation was. Your engagement helps me keep diving deep into these untold perspectives, from history's most pivotal moments. The last transmission from an Iraqi forward observation post came through at 11:57 p.m. on January 16th, a routine situation report noting clear skies and no enemy movement detected. 3 hours later, the war that would redefine modern combat began with a flash of light over Baghdad. Section 2. Thunder from clear skies. The electricity died block by block across Baghdad as transformers flashed blue in the pre-dawn darkness, each explosion marking another severed nerve in Iraq's command system. January 17th, 1991. At precisely 2:38 a.m. local time, the air war opened with F-117 Nighthawks striking Baghdad's most critical command nodes. Iraqi air defense operators stared at radar screens that showed nothing, no blips, no contacts, no warning of the invisible aircraft already over their heads. The first they knew of the attack was the sound of buildings collapsing and the acrid smell of high explosives drifting through shattered windows. In the Al-Qarq district, families huddled in basements as the concussions rolled overhead like thunder from clear skies. Children pressed against their mothers' shoulders, counting the blasts, while dust cascaded from ceiling joists and tea glasses rattled on tables. Bath party posters stared down from stairwells, Saddam's confident smile now seeming grotesque in the emergency lighting. But the opening moments held a shock that no one had anticipated. Minutes into Desert Storm, an Iraqi MiG-25 Foxbat, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Zuhair Dawood, managed what seemed impossible. He shot down U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander Scott Speicher's F/A-18 Hornet, making it the war's first American air combat loss. The victory was brief and costly. Dawood's MiG was destroyed by a responding coalition fighter moments later, but the downing proved Iraqi pilots weren't rolling over without a fight. Iraqi state radio crackled to life with defiant announcements, christening the coming conflict al-Ma'arik, the mother of all battles. Air raid sirens wailed across Baghdad as anti-aircraft tracers stitched desperate patterns against the night sky, gunners firing at sounds and shadows, their muzzle flashes creating brief constellations of futile resistance. The sensory assault was overwhelming. Windows flexed and shattered under overpressure waves. The ozone bite of nearby strikes mixed with the acrid tang of cordite and burning plastic. Grit ground between teeth as plaster dust settled on everything. Food, faces, prayer rugs spread in basement corners where families sought shelter from the mechanical apocalypse outside. For Iraqi forces scattered across Kuwait and southern Iraq, the opening night brought a different kind of terror. Coalition aircraft appeared without warning, their precision-guided munitions turning carefully prepared positions into smoking craters. Soldiers who had spent months digging bunkers and stringing barbed wire watched their work disappear in flashes of white-hot light. Major Rashid al-Tikriti, commanding a Republican Guard artillery battery hidden under a highway overpass near Basra, later described the helplessness of those first hours. His crews warmed flatbread on engine decks and traded cigarettes for radiator water, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy as the sky above them filled with the contrails of aircraft they couldn't see or engage. Radio communications degraded to static and fragments, leaving field commanders blind to the scope of the devastation. Iraqi air defense doctrine, based on Soviet integrated systems, assumed massed raids that could be tracked and engaged. Instead, they faced stealth technology and electronic warfare capabilities that rendered their radar networks useless. Operators learned to recognize the distinctive pitch of an incoming high-speed anti-radiation missile seconds before their screens went snow-white and their equipment died. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Iraqi forces had prepared for an enemy they understood: tanks they could see, aircraft they could track, soldiers they could fight face-to-face. This invisible death from above violated every assumption about how wars were supposed to unfold. In Baghdad's telephone exchanges, coalition precision strikes severed fiber-optic cables and destroyed switching equipment with surgical accuracy. Military couriers mounted motorcycles to carry orders through streets filled with rubble and broken glass, their engines echoing off empty buildings as the city's electronic nervous system died one node at a time. The contrast between coalition technology and Iraqi capabilities became starkly apparent in those opening hours. while American pilots used GPS navigation and thermal imaging to identify targets through smoke and darkness. Iraqi operators improvised countermeasures, stringing 23mm anti-aircraft guns on hotel rooftops, hiding SA-6 launchers in palm groves, praying for lucky hits against enemies they could barely detect. Air raids rattled windows nightly in residential districts. Families queued at dawn for ration bread while diesel shortages left elevators frozen mid-floor and hospital generators whining in the dark. Even as the power grid failed, the muezzin's calls drifted over blackout districts, and candles guttered in stairwells taped with plastic sheets to catch falling glass. The scope of the coalition air campaign was unlike anything in military history. Over 100,000 sorties across 43 days, each one planned and executed with industrial precision. Iraqi commanders quickly realized they were fighting an enemy that could see everything, strike anything, and disappear without trace. Imagine lying in a bunker beneath the desert, listening to the approaching rumble of jets you cannot engage, knowing that your position may have already been marked for destruction by satellites you cannot see. What Iraqi defenders didn't yet understand was that this opening barrage was merely the overture. The real symphony of destruction was still building, and their scattered, blinded forces were about to face innovations in warfare that would render their Soviet training manuals obsolete. The last coherent radio transmission from Baghdad's air defense headquarters came at 04:15 hours. All sectors report heavy losses, switching to backup communications. Then silence, broken only by the distant rumble of more aircraft inbound from the south. Section 3. The desert burns. Sergeant Hakim Mahmoud pressed his keffiyeh against his nose as the acrid smell of burning petroleum mixed with the metallic taste of fear in his mouth, watching American helicopters emerge from the oil smoke haze like mechanical vultures. The war had been raging for weeks when Iraqi forces launched their most desperate gambit, a preemptive strike into Saudi territory that would become known as the Battle of Khafji. From January 29th to 31st, 1991, Iraqi armored columns surged across the border, hoping to force a ground fight and inflict coalition casualties before the main Allied offensive could begin. For Iraqi commanders, Khafji represented more than tactical necessity. It was psychological warfare. If they could bloody the coalition's nose, force Americans to see their dead on television, perhaps the fragile alliance would crack under domestic political pressure. The plan relied on speed, surprise, and the assumption that coalition forces were as war-weary as the American public seemed to be. Tank Commander Lieutenant Yassin al-Dulaimi led his T-55 through the pre-dawn darkness toward Khafji, his crew silent, except for the metallic clanking of equipment and the diesel engine's growl. Through his periscope, the Saudi border town appeared deserted, too quiet for comfort. The absence of civilians was ominous. It suggested the coalition had evacuated the population in advance, meaning they knew what was coming. The attack began with artillery barrages that lit the horizon in stuttering orange flashes. Iraqi mechanized infantry advanced behind their tanks, expecting to face Saudi National Guard units armed with outdated equipment. Instead, they collided with US Marines and coalition special forces who had prepared defensive positions using thermal imaging and night vision equipment that turned darkness into tactical advantage. Survivors later described Khafji's firefights as surreal encounters fought through fog and oil smoke, street corners illuminated by burning BMPs, the chemical tang of expended propellant mixing with the sweet, sick smell of hydraulic fluid leaking from damaged vehicles. Iraqi soldiers found themselves fighting house-to-house battles they thought they understood, only to discover their enemies could see them clearly while they fired at muzzle flashes and shadows. The sensory overload was crushing. Radio communications dissolved into static, punctuated by screams and urgent Arabic commands. Tank crews sweated in their steel boxes as diesel fumes and cordite smoke filled fighting compartments. Outside, the crack of rifle fire mixed with the deeper boom of tank guns and the distinctive buzzsaw sound of American A-10 Warthogs diving on Iraqi positions. Private Mustafa Khalil, 19 years old and fighting his first battle, crouched behind a concrete barrier as tracer rounds sparked off the walls around him. The phosphorus burn of illumination rounds seared his retinas, leaving purple afterimages that made it impossible to distinguish coalition soldiers from shadows. His Kalashnikov felt inadequate against enemies who seemed to materialize from empty buildings, fire with deadly accuracy, then disappear. But Iraqi forces weren't simply cannon fodder. Veterans from the Iran War adapted quickly, using their knowledge of urban combat to turn Khafji's streets into mazes of ambush points and crossfire zones. They positioned snipers in mosque minarets, used civilian vehicles as mobile weapon platforms, and coordinated mortar strikes with deadly precision. The battle's intensity peaked when Iraqi forces managed to penetrate the town centre, raising their flag over the Khafji governor's building in a moment of desperate triumph. For a few hours, Baghdad's propaganda machine trumpeted the victory, broadcasting footage of Iraqi soldiers celebrating in Saudi streets, while coalition aircraft circled overhead like frustrated predators. Yet the tactical picture revealed the operation's fatal flaw. Iraqi forces had no air cover, no way to resupply under constant aerial attack, no electronic warfare capabilities to disrupt coalition communications. They were fighting a 20th century battle against 21st century opponents, brave but doomed by technological obsolescence. The end came with methodical brutality. Coalition aircraft isolated Iraqi forces by destroying their supply lines and escape routes. Anti-tank missiles fired from concealed positions turned Iraqi armor into burning monuments to tactical futility. Soldiers who had advanced with confidence found themselves trapped in a killing zone designed by enemies they could barely see. Meanwhile, across Iraq, a different kind of terror was unfolding. Modified Al-Hussein Scud missiles streaked from western desert launchers toward Israel and Saudi Arabia. 39 missiles struck Israel. 46 hit Saudi Arabia, intended to shatter the coalition by forcing Israeli retaliation that would drive Arab allies away from the American-led alliance. Transporter Erector launcher crews scattered across the desert, under constant surveillance, hunted by coalition aircraft and special forces teams who tracked their movements through satellite imagery and electronic intercepts. The crews lived like nomads, never staying in one position longer than necessary, always watching the sky for the aircraft they knew would come. The Scud attacks created a different kind of psychological warfare, air raid sirens wailing at 2 a.m. in Tel Aviv and Riyadh, civilians stumbling toward bomb shelters, while Patriot missile batteries engaged incoming warheads with mixed success. In Dhahran, a Scud penetrated the Patriot defense system and killed 28 American soldiers when it struck their barracks, proving that even America's technological superiority had gaps. Iraqi television looped footage of Patriot launches, presenting them as evidence that the coalition was vulnerable, that American technology wasn't invincible. But the propaganda couldn't disguise the reality that Iraq was losing the electronic warfare battle comprehensively. Put yourself in those boots for a moment, fighting an enemy you can't see, using weapons that seem primitive against opponents who treat combat like a video game they've already mastered. What Iraqi soldiers at Khafji couldn't know was that their brave but futile offensive had actually served coalition interests perfectly, drawing Republican Guard units into the open where they could be identified, tracked, and systematically destroyed from the air. The last Iraqi radio transmission from Khafji came at 14:20 hours on January 31st. Request immediate extraction, position untenable, taking heavy casualties from all directions. By sunset, the survivors were either dead, captured, or retreating through the desert toward an even more devastating reckoning that awaited them on their home ground. Section 4. The Shelter and the Storm. The concrete walls of the Amiria shelter trembled as Captain Nasser al-Mahmoud counted the rhythmic thuds of bombs falling across Baghdad, each impact sending dust cascading from the ceiling, where hundreds of civilians huddled in the darkness below. February 13, 1991. At 4:30 a.m., 2 American F-117 stealth bombers approached what their intelligence identified as a military command bunker. What they struck instead was a civilian air raid shelter, packed with families seeking refuge from the nightly bombardments. The explosion killed over 400 people, mostly women and children, in an instant that would haunt both sides of the conflict for decades. The blast created a furnace inside the reinforced concrete structure. Rescuers who arrived at dawn clawed at soot-slick walls with bare hands, following the sounds of survivors trapped in pockets of superheated air. The smell was indescribable, concrete dust mixed with melted plastic, burned metal, and the sweet, sick odor of human tragedy that would linger in the nostrils of rescue workers for years. For Iraqi civilians, the Amiria strike represented the war's most personal violation. These weren't soldiers or government officials, they were ordinary families who had followed air raid procedures, sought official shelter, and died for the crime of being in the wrong place when precision-guided munitions arrived. The psychological impact rippled through Baghdad's remaining population, forcing impossible calculations about where safety might exist in a city under systematic bombardment. But Amiria was an anomaly in a campaign that otherwise demonstrated unprecedented surgical precision. Coalition forces had been methodically dismantling Iraq's infrastructure for weeks, targeting power grids, communications networks, transportation hubs, and military command centers with industrial efficiency. The broader civilian population faced a different kind of warfare, not mass destruction, but the systematic erasure of modern life. Electricity disappeared in rolling blackouts that left hospital generators whining in the darkness. Diesel shortages paralyzed elevators, trapping residents in high-rise apartments without water or power. Civilians queued at dawn for ration bread, while municipal services collapsed around them. Yet even as the grid failed, the muezzin's calls continued to drift over blackout districts, and families gathered around battery-powered radios to hear news from the outside world. The war's technological asymmetry became most apparent in Iraq's desperate attempts at electronic countermeasures. Radar operators learned to improvise, hiding surface-to-air missile launchers in palm groves, stringing corner reflectors and microwave ovens near dummy installations to decoy high-speed anti-radiation missiles. Mobile radar units moved constantly, setting up beside smoldering generator trailers where previous crews had tried and failed to engage invisible aircraft. Dr. Layla Hassan, working in Basra's main hospital, watched the war's human cost accumulate in emergency rooms overflowing with shrapnel wounds and smoke inhalation cases. Surgeons operated by flashlight during rolling power outages, their hands steady despite the constant rumble of aircraft overhead. Medical supplies dwindled under sanctions, forcing doctors to reuse equipment and ration pain medications while treating injuries that ranged from blast trauma to the psychological collapse of children who had stopped speaking after weeks of bombardment. The bombing campaign's psychological architecture was deliberate and devastating. Coalition planners understood that destroying Iraq's command structure would paralyze military resistance more effectively than destroying individual tanks or artillery pieces. Every severed communication link, every darkened radar screen, every silent radio represented another strand in the web of isolation that was enveloping Iraqi forces. Meanwhile, across the Kuwaiti desert, Iraqi frontline soldiers adapted to a war unlike anything their Soviet training had prepared them for. Units burned waste oil in 55-gallon drums for warmth, the acrid smoke giving trenches a metallic taste and constant cough that mixed with the fierce sweat of men who knew death could arrive without warning from any direction. Soldiers wrapped kafirs over gas masks, convinced that chemical weapons were imminent. False alarms shrieked as petroleum fumes and desert dust fooled detection equipment, sending entire companies scrambling into protective gear that made the desert heat unbearable. The psychological warfare was as effective as the kinetic strikes. Iraqi forces spent as much energy fighting their own imaginations as they did preparing for actual attacks. Captain Mahmoud Yassin, commanding an artillery battery hidden under a highway overpass near Kuwait City, described the surreal nature of modern warfare. His crews maintained their guns meticulously, registered fire missions on potential target areas, and waited for orders that might never come. They could hear the war raging around them, the distant rumble of aircraft, the sharp crack of precision strikes, the metallic screech of tracked vehicles moving through sand, but they rarely saw the enemy. The isolation was complete. Radio communications degraded to fragments and static. Courier networks collapsed under aerial interdiction. Supply convoys disappeared between departure and arrival points, leaving forward units to survive on cached ammunition and canned rations that tasted like dust and despair. Republican Guard formations, the regime's elite units, found themselves trapped in a technological gap that no amount of courage or tactical skill could bridge. Their T-72 tanks and BMP fighting vehicles were formidable against conventional opponents, but they faced precision-guided munitions, thermal imaging, and satellite surveillance that rendered traditional camouflage and concealment obsolete. Imagine spending months preparing defensive positions, learning every fold in the desert terrain, coordinating with neighboring units only to discover that your enemy can see through darkness, smoke, and camouflage netting as if it were glass. What Iraqi forces couldn't comprehend was that they were witnessing the birth of a new form of warfare, one where information dominance and technological superiority could defeat numerical advantage and geographical knowledge with surgical efficiency. Oil smoke rain began falling across Kuwait as retreating Iraqi units implemented a scorched earth policy, torching over 600 oil wells that would stain the sky black for months and leave petroleum droplets on balconies throughout the region. But the real inferno was still building a ground campaign that would demonstrate just how completely modern warfare had evolved beyond the Soviet doctrine that formed the backbone of Iraqi military thinking. Section 5. 100 Hours. The low growl of approaching M1 Abrams tanks vibrated through Lieutenant Ahmed Rashid's chest as he peered through his T-55's periscope, watching thermal sights that could see through night, dust, and smoke materialize from the desert like glowing eyes of death. February 24th, 1991. The ground war began with a deception so complete that Iraqi forces were still firing pre-registered artillery at empty desert, while coalition columns had already slipped west through soft sand, executing the largest left-hook maneuver in military history. What Iraqi commanders expected to be a frontal assault against their prepared positions became a flanking movement that bypassed their strongest defenses and struck where they were weakest. The 7th Corps' advance ripped deep into Iraq with a speed that shattered every assumption about desert warfare. American tank crews had trained for years in similar terrain at the National Training Center, learning to navigate by GPS while Iraqi forces still relied on compass bearings and landmark recognition. The technological gap wasn't just about equipment, it was about entirely different ways of understanding space, time, and battlefield geometry. For Iraqi frontline divisions underfed, undertrained, and isolated by weeks of aerial bombardment, the ground assault felt like fighting ghosts. Coalition forces appeared without warning from directions that should have been impossible, their thermal imaging systems rendering Iraqi camouflage useless. Tank commanders who had spent the Iran war learning to fight at visual ranges found themselves facing enemies who could kill them from distances their guns couldn't reach. Private Salman Karim, manning a machine gun nest along what his commanders called the main axis of advance, described the surreal nature of the coalition attack. For hours, his sector remained quiet, while distant explosions suggested heavy fighting elsewhere. Then, American armor appeared on his flanks, not where the map said they should be, not advancing along the predicted routes, but emerging from desert that Iraqi planners had considered impassable. The sound of modern tank warfare was unlike anything from previous conflicts. Iraqi crews heard only a low mechanical growl before 120mm Sabot rounds peeled their turrets like tin cans. The depleted uranium penetrators sliced through Soviet-era armor as if it were cardboard, creating spalls of molten metal that ricocheted inside fighting compartments and killed crews instantly. Along the Wadi al-Batin axis, Iraqi artillery batteries fired their carefully planned defensive missions at coordinates where coalition forces should have been. Instead, they pounded empty sand while American and British columns moved through the western desert, guided by satellite navigation that let them maintain formation and speed across terrain that would have scattered conventional forces. The Tawakkalna Division, one of Iraq's elite Republican Guard formations, fought back at 73 Easting and Norfolk with the desperation of soldiers who understood they were witnessing the end of an era. Their T-72 tanks were technically superior to many coalition vehicles, their crews veterans of 8 years of war against Iran, but they faced an enemy that combined technological superiority with tactical innovations that rendered traditional armored warfare obsolete. Captain Hakim al-Tikriti, commanding a company of Republican Guard armor, later described the psychological impact of fighting an invisible enemy. American tanks engaged his positions from ranges where their thermal signatures appeared as distant heat shimmer. By the time Iraqi gunners acquired targets, their positions had already been bracketed by GPS-guided artillery fire missions that arrived with mechanical precision. The human cost was immediate and devastating. Tank crews who survived the initial impact of sabot rounds found themselves trapped in burning steel coffins, their escape hatches jammed by twisted metal. The lucky ones died quickly from overpressure or spalling effects. The unlucky burned alive in fuel fires that reached temperatures hot enough to melt aluminum components. Iraqi infantry fared no better against coalition technology. Soldiers who had learned to fight in the trenches and urban ruins of the Iran war found themselves exposed on flat desert terrain against enemies equipped with night vision equipment, thermal imaging, and precision-guided artillery support. Their Kalashnikov rifles and rocket-propelled grenades were deadly at close range, but useless against opponents who could kill them from distances measured in kilometers. The psychological collapse was systematic and complete. Entire companies surrendered with hands raised high, pockets turned out to show no detonators or hidden weapons. Arabic leaflets dropped by coalition aircraft promised water and fair treatment luxuries that seemed impossible after weeks of bombardment and isolation. Many Iraqi soldiers had gone days without adequate food or clean water, their uniforms caked with sand and diesel fuel. But the war's most haunting image emerged along the highway between Kuwait City and Basra, where retreating Iraqi forces created what became known as the Highway of Death. The road became a vision of mechanized hell, charred convoys stretching for miles, burst fuel tanks and melted tire rubber cooling on tarmac, personal effects scattered among the wreckage like evidence of lives interrupted mid-sentence. Coalition aircraft caught the retreat in the open, attacking with cluster bombs and precision-guided munitions that turned military vehicles into burning monuments to tactical obsolescence. Iraqi soldiers abandoned their equipment and ran across the desert, leaving behind tanks, armored personnel carriers, and supply trucks that represented years of military investment. The sensory impact was overwhelming for coalition soldiers who witnessed the aftermath, the smell of burned metal mixed with diesel fuel and worse things, while the desert wind scattered documents and personal photographs across sand already stained with oil and hydraulic fluid. Some vehicles were so thoroughly destroyed that their original function became unrecognizable, steel twisted into abstract sculptures by the heat of secondary explosions. Amid the chaos, individual acts of desperation and courage stood out like flashes of humanity in a mechanized apocalypse. Iraqi gunners improvised defensive measures, stringing 23mm anti-aircraft guns on highway overpasses, hiding surface-to-air missile launchers in civilian areas, praying for lucky shots against aircraft that seemed to appear and disappear at will. Picture yourself trying to fight an enemy you can barely see, using weapons that were obsolete before you learned to operate them. In a war where technology had advanced beyond your training, your doctrine, and your understanding of how battles are supposed to unfold. What Iraqi forces discovered in those final hours was that courage, training, and tactical skill meant nothing against opponents who had fundamentally redefined the relationship between information, technology, and military power. POW processing centers filled rapidly. Over 70,000 Iraqis, captured and transferred by early March, many dehydrated, some barefoot, all carrying the 1,000-yard stare of soldiers who had witnessed the future of warfare and found themselves on the wrong side of history. The ground war lasted exactly 100 hours, but for most Iraqi units, the sound of surrender was simpler than the complex machinery of modern combat, just the crinkling of leaflets and the plastic zip of restraining ties. Section 6. When the smoke cleared. The acrid taste of defeat mixed with burning oil in Colonel Majid Hassan's mouth as he watched his surviving Republican Guard tanks limp northward through the smoke of 600 burning oil wells, their crews silent with the knowledge that Iraq's military had just been dismantled in 4 days. March 3rd, 1991. Ceasefire talks opened at Safwan airfield, where Iraqi generals sat across from coalition commanders in a scene that captured the war's lopsided outcome. The meeting took place in a tent surrounded by American armor, with Iraqi officers arriving in vehicles that bore the scars of weeks under aerial bombardment. The contrast was deliberate and devastating, victors dictating terms to a defeated army that had been systematically destroyed by technologies its commanders barely understood. Republican Guard commanders seethed as they signed documents that formalized their humiliation. Elite brigades had survived but were bloodied, their logistics networks shattered, their communications destroyed, their tactical doctrine rendered obsolete. These were officers who had fought Iran to a standstill over 8 years, who understood conventional warfare and believed in their training. Now they faced the reality that modern combat had evolved beyond their comprehension. The human cost of Iraq's miscalculation was staggering but disputed. Casualty estimates ranged around 100,000 to 120,000 military dead, with heavy losses during the retreat and subsequent uprisings that would convulse the country. The numbers were imprecise because the war's technological nature left many victims vaporized by precision munitions or buried under collapsed bunkers. But the real shock came not from coalition forces, but from Iraq's own population. South of Basra, returning conscripts began shooting portraits of Saddam Hussein, a small axe of rebellion that spread like wildfire through cities that had endured decades of authoritarian rule. Within days, uprisings erupted across Shia cities in the south and Kurdish regions in the north, turning Iraq's military defeat into a broader crisis of legitimacy. Private Ali Mahmoud, returning to his home in Nasiriyah, described the surreal atmosphere of a country where the government's monopoly on violence had suddenly evaporated. Ba'ath Party offices stood empty, their windows broken, and revolutionary slogans spray-painted on walls. Local militias armed themselves with weapons abandoned by retreating army units, while civilians who had endured years of oppression settled scores with regime loyalists. The regime's response was swift and brutal. Republican Guard units that had survived the coalition onslaught turned their weapons on Iraqi civilians, using helicopters and tanks to crush neighborhoods and shrine courtyards. Human Rights Watch documented mass reprisals, where thousands were executed in systematic campaigns designed to terrorize the population back into submission. In Basra, witnesses described rebels fighting with axes and knives against regime militiamen, the desperation born from weeks of war, followed by the brief hope that Saddam's government might actually fall. The uprising's improvised nature reflected the broader collapse of institutional authority, as ordinary citizens attempted to overthrow a system they had never been allowed to challenge openly. The international community's response revealed the war's limited objectives. Coalition forces, having achieved their stated goal of liberating Kuwait, watched from the sidelines as Iraqi aircraft that had been grounded during the air campaign resumed operations against domestic targets. The same precision-guided weapons that had demolished military infrastructure remained unused, as civilians died in places like Karbala and Najaf. Dr. Fatima al-Rashid, working in a makeshift hospital in southern Iraq, witnessed the uprising's medical dimension. Casualties arrived with injuries that ranged from gunshot wounds to burns from phosphorus weapons used by government forces. Medical supplies remained scarce due to ongoing sanctions, forcing doctors to operate without adequate anesthesia while treating injuries inflicted by an army that had been defeated abroad but remained lethal at home. The Kurdish uprising in northern Iraq followed a different trajectory but reached a similar conclusion. Peshmerga fighters, emboldened by the regime's apparent weakness, liberated cities like Suleymania and Erbil before Republican Guard reinforcements arrived to crush the rebellion with systematic brutality. Mass refugee movements followed, with hundreds of thousands fleeing toward Turkey and Iran to escape government reprisals. Coalition governments, faced with images of refugees freezing in mountain camps, implemented Operation Provide Comfort in April 1991. The humanitarian intervention created a Kurdish safe haven north of the 36th parallel, where Allied aircraft enforced a no-fly zone that prevented Iraqi forces from using air power against civilian targets. A similar zone followed in the south in August 1992, limiting regime operations below the 32nd parallel. The no-fly zones represented a new form of containment, not occupation, but the systematic degradation of Iraqi sovereignty through technological dominance. Coalition aircraft patrolled Iraqi airspace for over a decade, engaging surface-to-air missile sites and radar installations while maintaining the fiction that Iraq remained a sovereign state. For ordinary Iraqis, the war's end brought new forms of suffering that would persist for years. Sanctions continued strangling the economy, while the government rebuilt its internal security apparatus with ruthless efficiency. A kilo of tomatoes could triple in price overnight, as ration coupons and whispered black market prices replaced posted signs in markets throughout the country. Mechanics stripped alternators from civilian cars to keep essential equipment running. Scavenged batteries hummed under blankets to hide their light from patrol aircraft that might identify military activities. The technological gap that had doomed Iraq's army now extended to civilian infrastructure, creating shortages of everything from medical supplies to water treatment chemicals. The psychological impact proved as lasting as the physical destruction. Iraqi cultural programming spiked with poets, reciting laments that compared the defeat to historical disasters, while pop songs looped footage of troops marching under sand-yellow filters that made their defeat seem distant and dreamlike. Imagine returning home from a war where your training, equipment, and understanding of combat had been rendered obsolete, only to discover that your country was tearing itself apart while foreign aircraft patrolled overhead with impunity. What Iraqi soldiers and civilians experienced in 1991 was the birth of a new international order, where technological superiority could impose political solutions without traditional occupation, a preview of conflicts that would define the next 3 decades. The war etched sensory memories that would haunt survivors for generations. The ozone bite of nearby strikes, grit grinding between molars, windows flexing before shattering, and the thin loudspeaker plea that had become the soundtrack of surrender. Put down your weapons, water is ahead. But for Iraq, the real reckoning was just beginning, as a shattered country struggled to rebuild under the weight of sanctions, uprisings, and the knowledge that the rules of warfare had changed forever. Section 7. The Long Shadow. The sweet smell of diesel tea brewed over jerrycan fires lingered in Corporal Yasir Habib's memory as he sat in a refugee camp outside Amman, one of thousands of Iraqi soldiers who had deserted rather than face another war they couldn't win. The Gulf War's aftermath stretched across the Middle East like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, each wave carrying consequences that would reshape the region for decades. What had seemed like a decisive military victory for the coalition became the opening chapter of a longer, more complex story about power, technology, and the unintended consequences of overwhelming force. For Iraq's surviving military leadership, the war's lessons were bitter but clear. Soviet-era doctrine, equipment, and training had proven utterly inadequate against Western technological superiority. The defeat wasn't just tactical, it was paradigmatic, demonstrating that conventional military thinking had become obsolete virtually overnight. Tank battles, artillery duels, and massed infantry assaults belonged to a previous era of warfare. General Wafiq al-Samarrai, former head of Iraqi military intelligence, later described the psychological impact on Iraq's officer corps. Men who had spent their careers mastering the art of conventional warfare discovered that their expertise was worthless against enemies who fought by entirely different rules. The humiliation went beyond personal pride to challenge fundamental assumptions about how nations projected power and defended territory. The war's technological demonstrations had global implications that extended far beyond the Persian Gulf. Military planners worldwide studied the conflict's lessons, recognizing that precision-guided munitions, satellite navigation, and electronic warfare had fundamentally altered the strategic balance. Nations that couldn't afford such systems faced the prospect of military irrelevance, while those possessing advanced technology gained disproportionate influence. But the human cost continued accumulating long after the ceasefire signatures dried. Post-war Iraq became a laboratory for studying the effects of comprehensive sanctions on a modern society. Unmarked minefields and cluster bomblets continued maiming civilians and farmers along retreat routes and defensive positions, turning productive agricultural land into hazardous wastelands that would claim victims for years. In Iraqi hospitals, doctors struggled with medical crises that reflected the war's broader impact. Childhood mortality rates increased as water treatment facilities remained damaged and medical supplies stayed scarce under sanctions. Dr. Adnan Pachachi, working in a Baghdad pediatric ward, described watching children die from treatable diseases, while essential medications remained embargoed by international restrictions. The sanctions regime created a parallel economy built on smuggling, corruption, and survival strategies that undermined Iraq's social fabric. Families that had belonged to the middle class before the war found themselves bartering personal possessions for basic necessities. Teachers, engineers, and government workers supplemented their incomes through black market activities that would have been unthinkable during peacetime. Children who had lived through the bombing campaigns carried psychological scars that manifested in night terrors, developmental delays, and behavioral problems that overwhelmed Iraq's mental health infrastructure. School attendance dropped as families needed children to work or care for war-disabled relatives, creating an entire generation whose education was interrupted by conflict and its aftermath. The war's environmental consequences proved equally lasting. Kuwait's oil fires over 600 wells torched during the Iraqi retreat burned for months, creating an ecological disaster that affected regional weather patterns and agricultural productivity. Black rain fell across the Gulf region, coating buildings and crops with petroleum residue that would take years to fully dissipate. Iraqi veterans returning to civilian life faced a society that had fundamentally changed during their absence. The uprising's brutal suppression had eliminated many community leaders and civil society organizations, leaving a population traumatized by both war and internal repression. Social trust, already damaged by decades of authoritarian rule, eroded further as neighbors reported each other to security services, afraid of continued unrest. The Kurdish safe haven in northern Iraq became a testing ground for humanitarian intervention and international law. Operation Provide Comfort established precedents for protecting civilian populations through military force, concepts that would influence international responses to crises in Somalia, Bosnia, and beyond. The no-fly zones represented a new form of semi-sovereignty, where Iraq retained nominal control over territory while coalition aircraft enforced behavioral constraints. Regional powers drew their own lessons from Iraq's defeat. Iran, having fought Iraq to exhaustion during the 1980s, watched with satisfaction as their former enemy was comprehensively humbled. The Gulf monarchies, initially grateful for coalition protection, began questioning their dependence on American military guarantees while investing in more sophisticated defense systems. Israel's restraint during the Scud attacks, a decision influenced by American pressure and promises of enhanced security cooperation, demonstrated the complex diplomatic calculations underlying modern warfare. The precedent established new expectations about how regional conflicts could be contained through superpower management, even when direct allies came under attack. For many Iraqi families, the war's memory crystallized around specific sensory details that transcended political analysis. The taste of sand-gritty bread during the siege, the sound of children's cries echoing through basement shelters, the sight of personal belongings scattered along highways where convoys had been destroyed, the smell of burning oil that clung to clothing for weeks after the fires were extinguished. Some soldiers wrote letters home on ruled paper, their words carrying past censors to reach families who wondered if their men were dead or alive. Others kept diaries that recorded the war's daily indignities, the shortage of clean water, the constant fear of aerial attack, the gradual breakdown of military discipline as units realized they were fighting an unwinnable battle. Imagine trying to explain to your children why their country had been defeated so completely, why the prosperity and pride they had known before the war might never return, why the future seemed smaller and darker than the past they remembered. The Gulf War established templates for American military intervention that would define the next 3 decades of international relations. The combination of overwhelming technological superiority with limited political objectives, the use of humanitarian concerns to justify military action, and the expectation that advanced militaries could achieve decisive victories with minimal casualties. What Iraqi survivors couldn't know in 1991 was that their country's ordeal was far from over, that the Gulf War was merely the first act in a longer tragedy that would unfold over decades of sanctions, inspections, and eventual invasion. The war's true legacy lay not in its decisive military outcome, but in the questions it raised about power, sovereignty, and survival in an age when technological advantages could render traditional military thinking obsolete virtually overnight. Section 8. Echoes of Thunder. The silence that followed the guns felt heavier than their roar, a quiet so profound that veteran Sergeant Karim al-Basri could hear his own heartbeat as he walked through the abandoned trenches near Kuwait City, searching for meaning in the debris of a war that had redefined everything he thought he knew about combat. 20 years later, the Gulf War's reverberations continued shaping Middle Eastern politics, military doctrine, and international relations in ways its participants never anticipated. What seemed like a conclusive victory in 1991 became the foundation for decades of instability, technological arms races, and the gradual transformation of warfare from industrial-age mass combat to information-age precision operations. For Iraqi society, the war's most lasting impact wasn't the immediate destruction but the slow strangulation that followed. Sanctions persisted throughout the 1990s, creating a generation of Iraqis who grew up knowing their country only as a pariah state, isolated from the global economy and technological advancement. The effects compounded annually: infrastructure decay, brain drain as educated professionals emigrated, and the emergence of survival economies built around smuggling and corruption. The flag that gained the takbir, Allahu Akbar, in 1991, officially presented as both patriotic and Islamic, became a symbol of how the regime attempted to transform military humiliation into religious resistance. Many Iraqis believed the words were written in Saddam's own hand, though historians debate whether this was propaganda or authentic calligraphy. The edition reflected broader regional trends toward religious nationalism, as secular ideologies proved inadequate for explaining devastating military defeats. International weapons inspectors who arrived in the war's aftermath discovered the true scope of Iraq's weapons programs, including biological and chemical capabilities that had gone largely undetected during the conflict. The revelations vindicated coalition concerns while raising uncomfortable questions about intelligence failures that had underestimated Iraqi capabilities in some areas while overestimating them in others. The war established new paradigms for military-media relations that would influence every subsequent conflict. Real-time television coverage created expectations for surgical precision and minimal casualties that constrained military planners in later interventions. The CNN effect meant that public opinion could shift rapidly based on televised images, making sustained military operations politically vulnerable to single dramatic incidents. For military historians, the Gulf War represented a watershed between conventional and post-conventional warfare. The conflict demonstrated that information dominance, precision munitions, and technological superiority could achieve decisive results more effectively than traditional measures like territorial occupation or enemy force destruction. These lessons would inform American military doctrine for the next 3 decades. But the war's human dimension resisted technological solutions. Iraqi veterans carried psychological wounds that manifested differently from previous conflicts, not just combat trauma, but the deeper existential shock of discovering that their training, doctrine, and understanding of warfare had become obsolete. Many described feeling like medieval knights facing machine guns, brave but helpless against technologies they couldn't comprehend or counter. The environmental consequences proved equally persistent. Depleted uranium munitions used in tank-killing rounds left radioactive contamination across former battlefields, contributing to cancer clusters and birth defects that would affect Iraqi and Gulf War veteran populations for decades. The connection remained medically controversial, but the fear was real and lasting for families on both sides. Kurdish autonomy in northern Iraq, initially a humanitarian emergency measure, evolved into a functioning proto-state that would survive longer than many independent nations. The experiment in protected ethnic self-governance created precedents for international intervention that would influence responses to crises from Kosovo to Libya, establishing the principle that sovereignty couldn't shield governments from the consequences of attacking their own populations. Economic warfare proved as decisive as kinetic operations. The sanctions regime that began before the shooting started continued long after the ceasefire, demonstrating how financial and technological isolation could constrain state behavior more effectively than traditional military occupation. Iraq's experience became a case study in economic coercion that would inform Western approaches to Iran, North Korea, and Russia. The war's sensory memories crystallized into cultural artifacts that transcended political boundaries. Iraqi poetry from the period captured the disorientation of facing invisible enemies, while veteran accounts from both sides describe the surreal quality of technological warfare, the disconnect between pressing buttons and causing distant explosions, the unreality of combat conducted through electronic interfaces rather than direct human contact. Desert Shamal winds continued blasting former battlefields with talc-fine sand, gradually burying the physical evidence of the conflict, while preserving it in the memories of those who had experienced its intensity. Soldiers recalled the taste of gritty water, the sound of incoming artillery rounds, the sight of oil fires staining the horizon black, the smell of burning equipment mixed with fierce sweat and diesel exhaust. Many Iraqi families preserved letters written during the conflict documents that captured the war's daily reality in ways that official histories couldn't convey. The ruled paper bearing bath stamps, the censored rectangles where addresses had been inked out, the careful language that expressed love and fear while avoiding political commentary that might endanger recipients. The technological demonstrations that had seemed so decisive in 1991 would be replicated and refined in Afghanistan and Iraq, establishing patterns of American military intervention that emphasized overwhelming initial force followed by prolonged nation-building efforts. The template worked brilliantly for conventional military objectives, but struggled with the political complexities that followed military victory. Regional powers drew contradictory lessons from Iraq's defeat. Some invested heavily in conventional military modernization, hoping to narrow the technological gap through arms purchases and training programs. Others concluded that asymmetric warfare terrorism, guerrilla tactics, and weapons of mass destruction offered more realistic options for confronting technologically superior opponents. The war's most profound legacy may have been its demonstration that military power, however overwhelming, couldn't guarantee political solutions to complex regional problems. Iraq's swift defeat was followed by decades of instability that proved more costly and complicated than the original conflict, suggesting that decisive military victory might create as many problems as it solved. For a generation of military professionals worldwide, the Gulf War became the standard against which all subsequent conflicts would be measured. The last war where technological superiority produced such clear, rapid, and apparently decisive results. The expectation that future conflicts would follow similar patterns would prove both influential and misleading in the decades that followed. The war that lasted 100 hours on the ground continued reverberating through Middle Eastern politics for 30 years, its echoes still audible in contemporary conflicts where precision weapons, information warfare, and technological asymmetries shape outcomes more than traditional measures of military strength. What began as a dispute over oil pricing and territorial boundaries had evolved into a preview of 21st century warfare, establishing precedents and expectations that would influence international relations long after the oil fires were extinguished, and the refugees had found new homes in distant countries that would never fully understand what they had experienced in the desert silence that followed the storm.